this decade was always going to be the decade where the Chinese system completely collapsed. The only reason we're even talking about China as a significant power is because of globalization. It was the end of World War II settlement that removed the Europeans from the capacity of intervening in China. It was the end of World War II and the settlement with the Japanese that prevented the colonization of China. Japan was winning in China right up until the bombs fell on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And then all of a sudden, the Chinese environment changed overnight. All the foreigners left, and the Chinese could fight their own internal civil war, which eventually the communists won. And then we got to a point 20 years later where the Soviets and the Chinese fought a near-nuclear conflict over border disputes, entered Nixon and Kissinger, and the rest is history because we basically convinced the Chinese to switch sides. They joined the globalized system and in turn for turning their backs on the Soviets. And that is what set up the strategic environment for China's growth ever since. However, that is not sustainable without intervention from the United States or globalization in general. The line of islands off the Chinese coast, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, if there's one thing they all agree on is that they're not China, and the Chinese have never been able to project power beyond that except during the global order because the Americans have forced everyone to be on the same side. That's breaking down now, and the Chinese don't have the capacity in any form to project power much beyond their own coastline. They do have a lot of ships. 90% of them can't sail more than 1,000 miles from shore, and that assumes they're going at a slow speed to save fuel in a straight line and no one's shooting at them. Really, China can barely make it past Taiwan, and China is the most internationalized economy in terms of its resource and its market dependence. So if the global system breaks down, that is it. The Chinese system implodes. And if China finds itself in a real war with anyone, someone, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the Vietnamese, the Indians, the Americans, someone is going to put a couple of destroyers in the Persian Gulf or in the Indian Ocean and cut the energy line. Because the United States hasn't been the world's largest energy supporter for some time, over a decade. It's China. China imports 85% of their energy, and 85% of that comes from the Persian Gulf, and the Chinese can't reach the Persian Gulf. So any breakdown in the regional or the global order, and it's lights out. And never forget that agriculture is an industrialized sector, and the Chinese import almost all of their inputs for that too. So you're talking about the lights going out, the trucks stopping, and famine within a year. It used to be a lot more opaque, but ever since Xi denigrated his own system into cult of personality, they've ceased making functional decisions at the top. A great example is what's going on with the Ukraine war. So there is this belief in China that the Russians will take Ukraine first. It'll kind of prove the theory that we have that we can take Taiwan easily. Clearly that's not the case, because while the Russians are clearly not performing to snuff, the Ukrainian army is not a regular army. They're doing great, don't get me wrong. But the power mismatch in that is not nearly as big as the power mismatch between China and Taiwan, because the Taiwanese have been preparing for this war now for 70 years, and they have a lot of modern equipment, and oh yeah, they're still an island. So scratch one, they know the strategic relationship will not go the way they were hoping. They're terrified of the boycotts and the sanctions, because the idea that shareholders would back away is something that they can't deal with economically. They need those connections in order to employ their own population. And the sanctions, say what you will about the Russian economy. It's a major exporter of both foodstuffs and energy. And the Chinese are major importers of both. So if we put a Russia-style sanction on the Chinese system, that's it. It's over. It collapses in less than a year. And then if you just need one more reason, it's like, I think there's plenty. Demographics. One-child policy started 40 years ago. They're literally running out of workers and consumers. It's the fastest aging society in human history. And some of the data they've been leaking out of the 2020 decade census suggests that this is them suggesting that they've actually overcounted their population by about 100 million people. And that's all people who were born since the one-child policy, and it's probably the vast majority of them being women. So there is no hope for a demographic reconstitution of this country. We've always known for demographics it was going to collapse this century because they're aging so fast there'll be less than half as many people in 2100 as there are now, assuming nothing goes wrong with anything else. And now with this new data from the census, we may have to speed that date up by 50 years. So in my opinion, this decade was always going to be the decade where the Chinese system completely collapsed. We're losing our boogeyman. I think we'll get by. Nuclear and coal are feasible options for them for electricity. That is absolutely true. Their nuclear power plants are by far not the most efficient in the world, but they get the job done. And they have plenty of soft coal. My concern, because of the demographic stance, is far more basic, though. If you don't have enough people to consume, you don't have enough to fuel your economic system. And so the Chinese have always been dependent, far more than most, on imports for the raw commodities and then exports for the finished goods. You can't do that without a globalized system. So you're talking about the best case scenario here being a North Korea-like environment where the food goes away but the power stays on. It could be worse. Chinese history is replete with examples of it being worse, but what you just identified is probably the best case scenario. On the investment side, the Chinese have had a reputation for using a lot of capital flight and a lot of export earnings to purchase what they consider to be strategic assets around the world, and that has generated a lot of heartburn in a lot of places. Well, they now know that that's pointless because the Germans, who are, let's say, not, how should I put this, made some poor strategic decisions over the course of the last 30 years as regards to the Russians, they're already nationalizing Russian assets in Germany. The Germans, the ones who are the pacifists and socialists. So the Chinese are now realizing that everything they bought overseas is worthless. And they're trying to sell a lot of it, so at least they'll get some cash out of it. But they only want dollars.
China doesn't survive the decade as an industrial power, probably not even as a unified country. The demographic situation now there is so bad that, and the aging is happening so quickly, and the birth rate dropped so low so long ago, that by 2050, the population of China will be less than half of what it is today. Well, remember, Germany has more in their 60s and their 50s and their 40s and so on. Their demographic does this towards the children. China's does this. Their point of no return was 30 years ago. This is not a recent thing. Combination of the fastest urbanization humanity has ever experienced with the one-child policy at the same time, that was national suicide, and now they're dying. They no longer have a workforce that is competitive in any manufacturing sector. There is not a product that is made anywhere else in the world there's not a product made in China that can't be made cheaper elsewhere. And the only reason we still think of China as a manufacturing power at all is because of the pre-existing sunk costs of the industrial plant, but the COVID lockdowns are even removing that from the table. So there's no reason to expect China to ever get better. Also, their energy comes from a continent away, except for the part that comes from 2 continents away. Also, all of the inputs that they need for their food, with the exception of phosphate fertilizer, they're all imported. So anything happens to globalization for any reason, and this is a country that just ceases to exist. There is no way with deglobalization that China emerges from this decade with more than 700 million people. It's going to be that